That is something that we'll talk about today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time. Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there.
This wasn't a diplomatic shoulder shrug or a polite disagreement. As far as the Brits are concerned, this was the equivalent of a screaming match, because the UK's Prime Minister decided enough was enough. He delivered a truly British smackdown to America's favorite accidental Vice President, JD Vance. And let's just say, it was a long time coming. He didn't need to mention names. He didn't need to clarify and break down what he meant. Everyone in the room and beyond knew exactly what he meant and who he was addressing. Spoiler alert, it's JD Vance. Yes, the Vice President, who believes handing a microphone to every bigot in the world means freedom of speech, but we'll come to him later. Starmer is a former human rights lawyer, and now as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he reminded Vance that the UK wasn't in need of lectures on liberty. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, it will help us a lot. Especially not for someone who treats every single international visit like a Reddit thread and believes in humiliating every guest in the Oval Office. But Starmer wasn't firing shots randomly. He came prepared. He reminded Vance, and by extension the American civilians, that the UK isn't a dictatorship. They've been protecting free speech forever, but they do a lot more too, like protecting their people. A radical concept for someone like JD Vance.
If you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. The security guarantee and also the economic guarantee for Ukraine is to rebuild the country and ensure that America has a long-term interest.
To make matters worse, things haven't been great between the rest of the world and the USA. Ever since the new administration took over, JD's been burning bridges for fun. And just when you thought he couldn't embarrass himself more over the fiasco with President Zelensky, he actually made things worse. Before we get into what pissed off the likes of the UK and France, just take a look at his pathetic diplomacy. This is a man who's telling a wartime president that the United States would protect Ukraine, only if they get a cut of the profits. No, it's not totally absurd given how international politics work, but you don't say these things out loud. Jesus. Nothing really says strong alliance, like turning post-war reconstruction into a real estate pitch, huh? Yeah, we'll defend your democracy, but how about those minerals first? And then, for no reason whatsoever, Vance decided it might be fun to burn France and the UK too. Some random country. Yeah, we all know what you meant. Britain and France, apparently the countries that hadn't fought in a war for decades, but had their troops fighting and dying in Iraq and Afghanistan not too long ago, and in a bid to fight terrorism for an ally. It's like Vance doesn't even care about what he says. He just opens his mouth and sees where his words take him.
13 years since 6 young British soldiers were on patrol in Afghanistan when their vehicle was struck by an explosive, tragically killing them all. Sergeant Nigel Coop was 33. Corporal Jake Hartley was 20. Private Anthony Frampton was 20. Private Daniel Wade was 20. Private Daniel Wilford was 21. And Private Christopher Kershaw was just 19, a teenager. Tomorrow also marks the 18th anniversary of the death of Benjamin Reddy, a 22-year-old serving with 42 Commando Royal Marines, killed in Helmand Provost in 2007. These men fought and died for their country, our country.
That's how a statesman responds. None of the rude stuff from JD Keir Starmer didn't need to mention the JD by name. He didn't have to. As soon as he broke tradition in Parliament and honored the fallen soldiers on their anniversary, you knew exactly what was going on. This was an almost quiet takedown of Vance, and compared to his reckless Oval Office rhetoric, this speaks volumes of the gulf between the two. No hashtags, no shouting, no Fox interviews, only a solemn reminder. We've also lost many soldiers fighting alongside yours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's easy to forget numbers, but 642 is a large number by any stretch of the imagination. Hundreds more wounded. These aren't statistics. It was a straight-up slap to JD's made-up scenarios. There was no clap back from Starmer because he acts his age. He doesn't need to appeal to Generation Alpha to make a mark. He's the leader of a proud nation, and his response was full of facts and honor. Something that left JD Vance completely out of his depth, looking small and loud on the global stage.
Pour vous répondre, j'aimerais d'abord vous dire, et heureusement que le vice-président américain a corrigé ses propos, que la plus belle force d'une armée, c'est le courage de ses soldats. Et que je veux saluer la mémoire des quelques 600 soldats français morts pour la France depuis la fin de la guerre d'Algérie, qui méritent notre respect, le respect de nos alliés. Nous respectons les vétérans de tous les pays alliés. Nous entendons bien à ce que nos propres vétérans soient respectés.
If Keir's response wasn't brutal enough, Sébastien Lecornu, the French Minister of Armed Forces, also weighed in. You know, you can fault the French for many things, but never for diplomacy. Yet another measured response, full of poise and pride, made JD look like a real juvenile in contrast. In classic French fashion, Lecornu shamed JD and reminded the world that real courage isn't measured in some sort of weird war year calculator but in sacrifice. More than 600 French soldiers have died in service since the Algerian War, and most of them have fought shoulder to shoulder with the Americans. Brushing those sacrifices from some irrelevant and random country was arrogance dipped in ignorance. It wasn't diplomacy. Lecornu made sure, in the calmest and most French way possible, that respect is a two-way street. You gotta give some to earn some. And if you can't honor the dead, maybe you're not fit enough to lead the living. Then, just to twist the knife a tiny bit more, Lecornu acknowledged how Vance had corrected his remarks. If you were confused, that's French for, yeah, we saw you backpedal. We're just being polite about it.
JD Vance has denied insulting British troops over his random country jibe. The US Vice President spoke out to say how absurdly dishonest the claim was after he dismissed Britain as a random country.
Then 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years.
He's now facing calls to apologise after military veterans branded him shameful and was accused of erasing history. This comes days after Vance rubbished Prime Minister Keir Starmer's offer of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, with British and French boots on the ground.
And like clockwork, you know JD pulled out his spin instructor moves, backpedaling like never before. He was suddenly shocked that people were interpreting his plain comments as insulting. How were veterans outraged? How could the diplomats be offended? How were the historians having strokes about it all? So, of course, he decides to deny, deflect, and pretend like he didn't even say what he said. As if we live in the late 19th century, and we don't have rewind buttons. He says he didn't name any country because apparently, if you don't name drop, the insult doesn't count. What he forgot was that Britain and France were literally the only countries offering to send troops. So sure, he meant some other unnamed military power. It was nothing but gaslighting wrapped in a press release. As a result of this mockery, JD's been hounded by the international press. Veterans and diplomats have called for him to apologize. Basically, anyone who hasn't worked with Fox News has been ripping him to shreds, and others simply can't believe that the greatest democracy in the world has elected this man to lead them. But don't hold your breath. If there's one thing JD's more committed to than saying outrageous stuff, it's pretending like he never said them.
Former Veterans Minister Johnny Mercer and others called the Vice President's comments disrespectful to British soldiers who fought and died in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And you know you've royally messed up when even other conservatives don't see eye to eye. JD thought he could weasel out of this with a half-hearted denial, but the thing about the Brits is that they never forget. Just like that, along came Johnny Mercer, an ex-armed forces minister who pretty much called JD a clown. That's about as apt as it gets, because is there a better way of insulting Vance? He added that Vance had no idea what it's like on the battlefield. While he's busy chasing clout from the Rust Belt, Real soldiers, American and British, were out there sacrificing their lives. And what do they get as a result? This sheer excuse of a diplomat who's casually trashing them. The subtext couldn't be clearer. Vance talks way too much about war for someone who's never had to fight in one. JD's basically proven that his political instincts are not good enough to have him in the running for president because he belongs on Twitter, where he can act like the keyboard warrior that he is.
How dare you? How bloody dare you say that when 636 British military personnel lost their lives in wars alongside your military personnel in Iraq and Afghanistan? Many more were injured. Some are probably still bearing the emotional scars to this day, and they're not even come to terms with them yet. How dare you say that to what's supposedly your closest ally? I thought we'd seen some dumb US vice presidents. It was famously said of Gerald Ford he couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. Remember that one?
As for the rest of the British nation, they were fuming. They didn't need to remain diplomatic about JD's comments, so they made sure when given a platform, he was destroyed. Nick Ferrari led the charge. The British radio host joined the dogpile and absolutely unleashed on the US vice president. He brought the kind of fury that only idiocy can truly provoke. His response was raw and emotional. It cut straight through the noise and the smokescreens and attacked JD, asking how dare he even ask this of the UK. The country that has always stood with the US, through wrong and right. He said it the way it should have been said. This wasn't ignorance. This was a betrayal.
As his running partner and ended up being a vice president. But after his display on Friday in the Oval Office, and then obviously coming out with the comments he made this morning,
Yep.
it was pretty disgraceful, really. During Iraq, there was over 140,000 British troops deployed during the operation, and 46,000 on the initial deployment, of which I served in Iraq in 2003.
Did you?
And,
Right.
you know, alongside our American counterparts, you know, we actually served with the 15th Brigade Marine Expeditionary Force.
Right.
So for him to say that the UK is, you know, never been involved in said wars.
Then Nick opened the floor to the general British audience, and a former British serviceman, Craig, called in. This was something JD Vance couldn't really prepare for. A reality check comes from someone who has actually served and presented facts and experience, while showing more integrity than Vance has done in his entire tenure. He called the Vice President of America a disgrace. He told the listeners not to listen to anything that Vance had to say, because he knew what it's like being out there. Great Britain deployed over 140,000 troops during the Iraq War alone. And unlike JD, Craig wasn't just reading these numbers out. He lived the reality.
First of all, JD Vance needs a bit of a history lesson, but I think he was referring to the most of Europe, not just this country.
Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, John from Romford joined in with the discussion. Maybe he was a veteran, maybe not, but he was definitely a taxpayer with a functioning memory. John asked for JD Vance to be given a history lesson, and many believe that's the understatement of the year. This man needs so much more, because it's not like he slipped up with some dates. He's disrespected two allies who've supported the US for so many years. Either way, John's point lands, JD opens his mouth, and erases decades of cooperation and support. He should just open a YouTube conspiracy channel at this point and leave the vice presidency to someone who knows what they're doing. So if you enjoyed JD Vance getting destroyed by Keir Starmer, the French defense minister, and a number of other people, don't forget to watch our video of him also getting destroyed by Adam Bolton.